Hey everyone, quick look at this. See that? Almost 98% of you watching aren't subscribed yet. Subscribing is the best way to not miss any new infidelity stories and support what we do here. It's free and it makes a huge difference. Hit that subscribe button below. Okay, now to today's story.
It's a funny thing about trust, especially in a family. You build it up over years, brick by careful brick, thinking you've made something solid, something dependable. You think you know the people sitting across from you at Thanksgiving, dinner, the ones who share your husband's bloodline. But sometimes, the person you'd pour your coffee for every morning without a second thought is the one who slips something bitter into your cup when you're not looking. And the betrayal? It doesn't always arrive like a thunderstorm, all flashing lights and crashing noise. Sometimes it creeps in. It starts as just a tiny hairline crack in the foundation, disguised as something completely innocent, like a favor, a small favor. That's how it began for me, with my husband's son, Mark. And oh, what a favor it turned out to be. Mark, he's Gary's son from his first marriage. When Gary and I got together, Mark was already a young adult, mostly out of the house trying to find his footing. Our relationship was never awful, not really. More like cordial. Distant, but polite. Like neighbors who wave from across the street but don't really know what goes on behind each other's closed doors. Gary, bless his heart, always worried about Mark. Maybe too much. He always saw the struggling kid, not the grown man who sometimes seemed allergic to responsibility. I tried to be supportive, I really did. Played the role of the understanding stepmother, offered advice when asked, which wasn't often, kept my opinions mostly to myself. Maybe that was my first mistake, keeping too quiet, not wanting to rock the boat. Because there were little things looking back, tiny flags, barely waving. Like the time he borrowed Gary's tools and they just never quite made it back, or the elaborate stories about job interviews that never seemed to pan out. Hindsight's a cruel editor, isn't it? It highlights all the foreshadowing you missed. Anyway, about 6 months ago, Mark came over for dinner. It was unusual. He usually only showed up for major holidays or if he needed something. Gary was thrilled, fussing over him like he was still 16. We had roast chicken, I remember. Mark was quieter than usual, pushing his peas around his plate. Then, after Gary had gone to clear the dishes, he turned to me. He had this way of looking earnest, like a little boy asking for permission to have a cookie. "Linda," he started, lowering his voice like we were sharing some big secret, "I need a little bit of help. It's kind of embarrassing." He spun this tale about applying for some online course, something to better himself. He knew that phrase. Always got to Gary, and figured it worked on me too, I guess. He said he was having trouble with the application portal because he'd recently moved and his ID verification wasn't going through smoothly with his temporary address. He just needed, he said, to use my address and maybe my phone number on the initial form, just temporarily, just to get the application submitted before the deadline. He swore up and down it was just for the registration step, that he'd change it immediately afterwards, that no mail would come here, nothing. It was purely administrative, a temporary digital hurdle. He just needed a stable point of contact for a day or two. "It would be a massive help, Linda. Dad would be so pleased I'm doing this." And I hesitated, just for a second. A little flicker, deep down. Why couldn't he use Gary's details? Or a friend's? But then I looked at his face, trying so hard to look sincere, and I thought of Gary's hopeful expression earlier. What harm could it possibly do? It sounded so minor. Annoying. Maybe a bit cheeky, but ultimately harmless. It wasn't like co-signing a loan or handing over bank details. It was just an address, a phone number, on an online form, for a course. So, against that tiny, whispering doubt, I said yes. I told myself I was doing it for Gary, really. To support Mark's supposed effort to get his life together. What a fool I was. A well-meaning, trusting fool. I gave him the details, he typed something into his phone, thanked me profusely, and left soon after. It felt anticlimactic, too simple. That should have been another warning, shouldn't it? The sheer simplicity of the request, because the simple requests are sometimes the ones that hide the most complicated, tangled, and painful consequences. The first crack had appeared. I just hadn't realized it yet. I just thought I'd done a small kindness for family. For the first week or two after that chicken dinner, everything was quiet. Honestly, I almost forgot about the whole thing. Mark didn't call, nothing unusual arrived in the mail, and I started to think maybe that little nagging doubt I'd felt was just me being overly cautious, maybe even a bit unfair to Mark. Gary mentioned in passing that Mark seemed more upbeat, talking vaguely about getting things sorted. See? I told myself. It was nothing. Just a tiny digital hiccup for him, a moment of support from me. Simple. Maybe he really was turning a corner this time. It's amazing how easily we can convince ourselves of things when we want them to be true, or when the alternative seems too unpleasant to consider. But then the little ripples started. It began with a phone call, an unknown number. Usually I let those go to voicemail, but I was expecting a call back from the plumber, so I picked up. A cheerful young woman on the other end asked brightly, "Could I speak to Mark Jennings, please?" I was taken aback. "I'm sorry," I said. "He doesn't live here. You must have the wrong number." She sounded surprised. "Oh? Is this not Linda's phone number?" I confirmed it was. "Well," she said, a little less cheerful now, "this is the number listed on his recent credit application." Credit application? Not an online course registration? My stomach did a funny little flip. There must be some mistake, I mumbled and hung up, maybe a little too quickly. Credit application. The words echoed. Mark hadn't mentioned anything about applying for credit. Why would he use my number for that? I tried calling him. Straight to voicemail. I left a message, trying to sound casual, just checking in, mentioning the odd call. He never called back. That incident reminded me of something from years ago, shortly after Gary and I were married. Mark, probably in his early 20s then, had been staying with us for a few weeks between apartments. One afternoon, Gary realized his vintage watch, a gift from his own father, was missing from his dresser drawer. He was upset, naturally. Mark was sympathy personified. He helped Gary search everywhere, tutting about carelessness, even suggesting maybe the cleaning lady Gary occasionally hired might have pocketed it. He seemed genuinely concerned. Then, about a week after Mark moved out, Gary got a call from a pawn shop across town. Someone had tried to pawn the watch. The shop owner recognized the description Gary had circulated. The person? It wasn't Mark, not directly. It was a friend of Mark's who claimed Mark had given it to him to settle a debt, saying it was an old watch his father had given him. When confronted, Mark spun this elaborate story about borrowing it to impress someone, then panicked and asked the friend to sell it, intending to give Gary the money back later. He cried. Actual tears. Gary, seeing his son apparently remorseful and desperate, ended up feeling sorry for him and furious at the friend. Mark got off scot-free, promising to pay Gary back for the trouble, which of course never happened. I remember watching the whole performance, the smooth deflection, the way he twisted the narrative until he was almost a victim himself. And I remember thinking, he's good at this. Too good. But Gary was so relieved to get the watch back and believe his son's story, I just let it go. Another boat left unrocked. Now, standing in my kitchen holding my suddenly untrustworthy phone, that memory felt chillingly relevant. A few days after the phone call, a letter arrived. It was addressed to Mark Jennings, but at my address. It wasn't junk mail. It looked official, maybe from a bank or some kind of financial institution. It wasn't about an online course. Mark had sworn nothing would come here. This was a direct contradiction to his promise. I stared at the envelope, feeling a prickle of real anger mixed with anxiety. This wasn't just using my address temporarily. This felt different, deeper. I put the letter aside on the hall table, telling myself I'd give it to him next time I saw him. But I also made sure Gary didn't see it. I wasn't ready to explain it, partly because I didn't understand it myself, and partly because I didn't want to burst Gary's bubble about Mark's supposed progress. Later that evening, Mark called, not returning my previous call, of course. He sounded rushed, a little breathless. "Linda, hey, listen, did a letter arrive for me there? Might look like junk mail, maybe from Premier Solutions or something?" Premier Solutions. That wasn't the name on the envelope I held. I don't think so, Mark, I lied, the word feeling sticky and wrong in my mouth. Why was I lying for him? Oh, he said, sounding genuinely surprised. Weird. Must be delayed. Anyway, if anything does show up, could you just hold on to it for me? Super important. Thanks, you're a lifesaver. And he hung up before I could ask about the credit application call or the actual letter sitting 10 feet away from me. A lifesaver. The phrase felt like ice water trickling down my spine. What exactly was I saving him from? And more importantly, what was this favor really costing me? The unease was no longer a whisper. It was starting to shout. That letter sat on the hall table for 2 days, radiating a kind of toxic energy. Every time I walked past it, my stomach clenched. It felt like a physical weight in the house. Addressed to Mark, care of my home. It wasn't from Premier Solutions, whatever that was. The return address was clearly a major bank, one I didn't even use. Mark's breezy phone call, his blatant lie about expecting something different, played over and over in my mind. Why lie? What was he hiding? The urge to simply rip it open warred with a lifetime of respecting other people's privacy, even Mark's. But this felt different. It had my address on it. My phone number had already been dragged into something. This wasn't just his business anymore. It felt like it was becoming mine, whether I liked it or not. On the third morning after Gary had left for work, I couldn't stand it anymore. My hands were actually trembling slightly as I picked it up. It felt thick, important. With a deep breath, feeling like a criminal in my own home, I slid it open. The words inside swam before my eyes at first. It wasn't just one page, it was several. Thick, creamy paper, full of official jargon and tiny print. But the big print, the headings, were horrifyingly clear. Welcome to your platinum line of credit. Agreement and disclosure statement. Credit limit, $25,000. $25,000. My breath hitched. This wasn't some small administrative detail for an online course. This was a major financial instrument, and it listed my address as Mark Jennings' primary residence. There were details about activating the account, accessing funds, repayment schedules. It looked completely legitimate, terrifyingly so. He hadn't just used my address as a temporary contact point, he'd used it to establish residency for the purpose of securing a massive line of credit. The blood drained from my face. How had he even gotten approved? Had he falsified other documents? Used my phone number for verification calls I hadn't received or understood? That cheerful woman asking for him suddenly seemed sinister. The credit application she mentioned wasn't just an inquiry, it was this monstrosity. I sank onto the bottom stair, the papers rustling in my unsteady hands. Nausea rolled over me. The audacity of it, the sheer, calculated deception. Asking for that small favor with his earnest face, knowing full well what he intended to do. He hadn't just bent the truth, he'd shattered it. He'd used my home, my implicit stability, as collateral for his schemes. And the casual way he'd called, asking about a different letter, trying to throw me off the scent. It was cold, calculated. The memory of him manipulating Gary over the pawned watch came flooding back, 10 times stronger. This wasn't just youthful irresponsibility anymore. This felt malicious. My first instinct was pure, unadulterated rage. I wanted to call Gary immediately, scream down the phone about his deceitful son. But then, doubt crept back in. How would Gary react? Would he believe me? Or would he leap to Mark's defense, accuse me of snooping, of misunderstanding? I pictured his face, torn between his wife and his son, the inevitable argument, the stress it would cause him. He had some health issues last year. The doctor warned him about stress. Could I do that to him? Not yet. I needed to talk to Mark first. I needed to hear what lie he'd try to spin this time. I dialed Mark's number. My heart pounding against my ribs. It rang and rang, then finally he picked up, sounding bored. Yeah? Mark, I said, trying to keep my voice level, but it came out tight, strained. We need to talk, now, about a letter that arrived here. There was a pause. Then his voice shifted, became wary. What letter? I told you, must be delayed. Don't, I snapped, anger finally bubbling over. Don't you dare lie to me, Mark. I opened it. The one from the bank, the line of credit. Another pause. Longer this time. Then, unbelievably, he laughed. A short, sharp, dismissive sound. Oh, that. Geez, Linda, relax. It's just paperwork. Standard. Stuff for the business course I'm setting up. A $25,000 line of credit is not standard paperwork for an online course. I shot back, my voice rising despite myself. You used my address. You lied to me. Hey, calm down, he said, his tone becoming placating, almost condescending. It's all perfectly legal. Needed a stable address for the application, that's all. It's no big deal. Nothing to do with you, really. Nothing to do with me. My address, my potential involvement if things went wrong. How dare you say it's nothing to do with me? I whispered, furious. You deliberately misled me, Mark. You used me. Look, I gotta go, he said quickly, his voice turning hard. Don't make a big drama out of this, Linda. It's handled. Don't go upsetting Dad over nothing, okay? And he hung up. Just like that. Click. I stared at my phone, trembling with a mixture of rage and helplessness. It wasn't nothing. It was a huge, gaping something. And he wasn't sorry. He wasn't even trying to pretend anymore. He just expected me to swallow. It, to cover for him, to protect Gary from the truth. The full weight of his betrayal settled on me then. It wasn't just about the money, though that was terrifying enough. It was the calculation, the lack of remorse, the casual disregard for me, for Gary, for the trust we'd placed in him. He had known exactly what he was doing, and I had let him. The realization was a cold, hard stone in my stomach. The favor wasn't small. It was immense. And I was standing right in the middle of its fallout. After Mark hung up on me, I just sat there on the stairs for what felt like a very long time, the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the dead air. The silence in the house felt heavy, accusatory almost. My mind was racing, replaying his casual dismissal, his instruction, no, his warning, not to tell Gary. The nerve of him. He drops a potential financial bomb involving my home, my identity in some way, and then tells me to keep quiet about it? The anger was still there, burning hot, but underneath it, something colder was spreading. Fear. Real, icy fear. What had I actually allowed to happen by giving him those details? That $25,000 line of credit felt like just the tip of the iceberg. What else had he done, or tried to do, using my address as his anchor? That evening, when Gary came home, I nearly burst out with it the second he walked through the door. He came in whistling, looking tired but happy after a long day. He dropped a kiss on my cheek and said, "You won't believe who called me at the office today. Mark. Sounded really enthusiastic about that new course he's taking. Said it's opening up all sorts of possibilities. About time he found some direction, eh?" He beamed at me, his pride so nakedly hopeful it physically hurt to see it. How could I possibly tell him? How could I wipe that look off his face and replace it with the ugly truth about his son using us, using me? The words died in my throat. I managed a weak smile and said something non-committal about dinner. The conversation moved on, but a wall had just gone up between us, invisible but solid. He was chatting about his day, and I was nodding along, but my mind was miles away, trapped, with the sickening knowledge I couldn't share. It was the loneliest I'd felt in our entire marriage. Sleep that night was impossible. Every creak of the house sounded like an approaching disaster. Every headlight sweeping across the bedroom ceiling felt like an interrogation lamp. Mark's casual, "It's handled," echoed mockingly in my head. Handled by who? Certainly not by him, in any responsible way. By morning, I knew I couldn't rely on Mark for any information, and I couldn't burden Gary yet. I had to figure out how deep this rabbit hole went myself. My hands were shaking again as I sat down at the computer. I wasn't very tech-savvy, but I knew about credit reports. I'd seen commercials telling you to check them regularly. It felt invasive, scary, looking into that hidden financial world, especially now. What if my own credit was affected? What if he'd done more than just use my address? It took me nearly an hour, fumbling through security questions and verification codes. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I finally managed to access my own credit file online. And there it was. Not just the inquiry from the bank that issued the line of credit, but several others too. Recent ones. Credit card companies I'd never dealt with, an online payment platform, even an inquiry from a cell phone provider. All listed under recent activity, all clustered around the time Mark had asked for that favor. It wasn't just one line of credit. It looked like he'd gone on a spree, using my address, and maybe my phone number for verification, as proof of stability to apply for multiple things. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was worse than I thought. This wasn't just Mark being irresponsible. This was potentially identity fraud adjacent, using my information as a key component in his schemes. How much had been approved? What? Accounts were now active, ticking away like time bombs linked to my home? The report didn't give all those details, just the inquiries, but it was enough. It painted a picture of frantic, deceitful activity. I thought back to a time, maybe 5 years ago, when Mark had lost his job. Gary and I had him over for dinner, trying to be supportive. I'd spent hours helping him polish his resume, genuinely, trying to offer constructive advice, suggesting contacts I had. He'd seemed grateful at the time, nodding along, saying all the right things, but nothing ever came of it. Later, I heard through Gary that Mark had complained I was too pushy and didn't understand his field. It stung then, feeling like my genuine effort was twisted and dismissed. Now, remembering it in the context of this massive betrayal, it felt like just another piece of the same pattern. Take the help, discard the person, twist the narrative. My kindness had always been a resource for him to exploit, not a relationship to value. The digital pages of my credit report blurred in front of me. I felt sick, violated. He hadn't just lied. He'd potentially entangled my financial reputation with his mess. The scale of it felt overwhelming. This wasn't something I could just ignore or hope would go away. His casual dismissal on the phone now seemed utterly terrifying. Did he even understand the potential consequences? Or did he just not care, as long as he got what he wanted? Standing up from the computer, I felt a strange kind of calm descend amidst the panic. The shock was wearing off, replaced by cold resolve. I couldn't protect Gary from this anymore. The risk to us, to our financial stability, maybe even our legal standing if things were truly fraudulent, was too great. And I certainly couldn't rely on Mark to fix it. The wall between Gary and me had to come down, or I had to find someone else, someone professional to help me navigate this minefield Mark had laid. The time for quiet hesitation was over. Something had to be done. Now. That evening, I didn't wait. The resolve I'd felt staring at that damning credit report held firm. When Gary came home, I met him at the door before he could even take his coat off. I didn't ease into it. I just said, "Gary, we need to sit down. Right now. There's something serious I have to tell you about Mark, and you're not going to like it." The forced calm in my voice must have alerted him, because his usual cheerful greeting died on his lips. He followed me into the living room, his face etched with concern. I laid everything out on the coffee table, the line of credit agreement, the printout of my credit report with all those inquiries highlighted, my phone showing the call log where Mark had dismissed my concerns. And then, I told him everything. Starting with the small favor Mark had asked for, the lies, the phone calls, the letter, the confrontation, everything. I didn't spare Mark, but I didn't spare myself either, admitting I'd had doubts but ignored them, that I'd opened his mail, that I hadn't told Gary sooner because I was afraid of exactly this moment. Gary listened in silence, his face growing paler and paler as I spoke. He picked up the bank agreement, his hand visibly shaking as he read the credit limit. He looked at my credit report, tracing the list of inquiries with his finger. When I finished, he didn't speak for a long time. He just stared at the papers, then out the window, then at me. His first words weren't angry, not at me anyway. They were quiet, devastated. He lied all this time. The course. He lied about all of it. Then came the anger, a deep, slow-burning fury I'd rarely seen in him, directed squarely at his son. How could he? To you? Using our home like this? There was hurt there, immense hurt, but also a dawning, horrified understanding. He asked questions, sharp and precise, wanting to understand every detail of the deception. He wasn't angry I'd opened the mail. He was furious Mark had put me in that position. The wall I'd felt between us crumbled, replaced by a shared sense of shock and violation. We weren't husband and wife versus the problem. We were a team against Mark's catastrophic actions. The days and weeks that followed were a nightmare, honestly. It was a tangled mess of phone calls to banks, credit, card companies, fraud departments. We spent hours on hold, explaining the situation over and over again, filling out affidavits, sending copies of documents, putting fraud alerts on my credit file. We even had to consult with a lawyer friend to understand the potential liabilities and make sure we took the right steps to officially dissociate my address from Mark's newly acquired debts. It turned out he had managed to get a couple of credit cards approved before the banks got wise, all using my address. Shutting those down, disputing the connection, it was exhausting and stressful. It felt like a full-time job just cleaning up the wreckage Mark left behind. Every official envelope in the mail sent a jolt of anxiety through me for months. It's funny, isn't it? You spend years building a quiet, stable life, and someone you thought you knew can threaten to pull it all down in a matter of weeks with a few lies and clicks on a keyboard. Gary did confront Mark. I wasn't there, but Gary told me about it later. Apparently, Mark tried every trick in his playbook. Denial, minimization. It wasn't that much money. Shifting blame. Linda must have misunderstood. Emotional blackmail. Are you really taking her side against your own son? But Gary, armed with the cold, hard facts and fueled by a father's profound disappointment, didn't buckle this time. The conversation ended badly, with Mark apparently storming out after Gary told him he needed to take responsibility for his actions and that things between them would never be the same. We haven't heard from Mark since. He essentially vanished, leaving us to deal with the financial and emotional shrapnel. Gary carries that sadness with him. I see it in his eyes. Sometimes. The loss of the son he thought he had, or hoped he had, is a deep wound. So, what did I learn from all this? Well, I learned that trust, once broken like that, especially by family, leaves scars. It doesn't just magically heal. I'm more cautious now, more questioning, maybe a little less open. That naive part of me that wanted to believe the best, even against my better judgment, she's gone. And maybe that's not entirely a bad thing. I learned the importance of boundaries, those invisible lines that protect your peace and your well-being. I should have drawn mine much clearer, much sooner, regardless of keeping the family peace. Sometimes rocking the boat is necessary to stop it from sinking altogether. I also learned I'm stronger than I thought. Facing that mess head-on, dealing with the bureaucracy, supporting Gary through his grief while managing my own anger and fear. It showed me a resilience I didn't know I possessed. Our marriage survived, thankfully. In a strange way, weathering this storm together solidified something between Gary and me. We faced the ugly truth, and we chose to face it as partners. But it has changed things, inevitably. There's a shared history now, a knowledge of how deep betrayal can cut, that underlies everything. It's a quiet reminder that even in the closest families, you can never truly know everything that goes on in someone else's heart or head, and that sometimes the smallest yes can lead to the biggest, most complicated no you ever have to deal with. The cracks Mark made, they're still there. Faint lines on the surface, but we plastered over them, reinforced the structure. Life goes on, just differently. Wiser, perhaps, and definitely more careful about doing favors. Looking back on that whole dreadful period now, it's strange to say, but amidst all the anger, stress, and heartache, there was growth. It was the kind of growth forced on you, like a plant pushing through concrete, not the gentle kind you choose in good weather. But it was growth nonetheless. I definitely lost a layer of naivety, that willingness to just accept things at face value, especially when my gut was whispering warnings. I learned, the hard way, that keeping the peace at all costs can sometimes cost you far more in the long run. My voice is a little stronger now. Maybe not louder, but firmer when it needs to be. Setting boundaries doesn't feel like being unkind anymore. It feels like self-preservation, and that's okay. Turns out I had more steel in my spine than I ever gave myself credit for, and it certainly gave me a crash course in the complexities of people. How someone like Mark could be so capable of calculated deception while perhaps simultaneously believing his own justifications. How Gary's deep love for his son made him vulnerable to denial, a protective blindness I think many parents might understand, even if it causes pain elsewhere. Even my own actions, wanting to be supportive, avoiding conflict, then feeling foolish and angry, showed me how tangled our own motivations can be. People aren't simple characters in a play. We're messy, contradictory beings, driven by needs and fears and histories we can only guess at in others. But here's what I really want to leave you with. Even when you go through something that feels shattering, something that breaks your trust and makes you question everything, it doesn't have to be the end of the story. It's incredibly painful, yes, and it changes you. But humans are surprisingly resilient creatures. We can mend, we can learn. We can rebuild, maybe not exactly what we had before, but something new, something stronger, built on the hard-won wisdom of experience. The cracks might remain, visible reminders of the hurt, but they don't have to define the entire structure. There is potential for strength and healing, even after the worst blows. I shared this very personal story because, well, sometimes talking about these things helps. And it makes me wonder, family, trust, betrayal, these are universal themes, aren't they? Maybe you've navigated similar choppy waters with your own family, or perhaps learned tough lessons about setting boundaries or dealing with the fallout of someone else's actions. If you feel comfortable sharing, I'd genuinely be interested to read your own experiences or thoughts on all this down in the comments below. Sometimes just knowing you're not alone in these complicated human dramas makes a world of difference.